The church hall register showed 23 signatures for the harvest supper. The folding table nearest the east wall had held 23 plates of food, 23 glasses of elderflower cordial. And yet the kitchen log, kept, as it always was, by Mrs. Doris Peele, recorded only 22 portions of the lamb fricassee prepared that evening. One plate had been brought in from elsewhere. Nobody, in the subsequent inquiries, could explain from where. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where English villages harbour secrets far older than their parish records. Tonight we visit Truiston, where a harvest celebration has left one man dead, one woman silent, and a question no one in the village will answer directly. This is Poison in the Parish Hall, Chapter 1, The Harvest Table. The village of Truiston had, for as long as anyone could reliably remember, held its harvest supper on the 3rd Saturday of October. It was not an occasion that invited spontaneity. The long trestle tables were always arranged in a horseshoe in the main body of St. Cuthbert's Parish Hall, covered with the same cream linen cloths that smelled faintly of cedar, and were stored 11 months of the year in the chest beneath the stage. The vicar, the Reverend Mr. Alec Fowler, always gave the same brief grace, 4 lines no more, before taking his seat at the head of the left-hand table. Mrs. Edith Crane of the Women's Institute always supervised the kitchen, which she had done without interruption since 1947, though the children of the village school always performed a short recitation of autumn poetry at 7 o'clock, during which the adults listened with varying degrees of genuine attention, and the whole evening concluded by 9:30, at which hour Truiston's inhabitants returned to their homes in the calm and orderly fashion one might expect of a village that had given the world 2 county councillors and a minor poet. That October it concluded rather differently. By 20 minutes past 10, the ambulance had arrived. By 11, the hall had been cleared. By the following morning, the word that passed between neighbours over garden fences and across post office counters was not autumn or harvest, but something quieter and more troubling. The word arsenic is spoken with that particular English restraint that makes terrible things sound almost administrative. The dead man was Mr. Gerald Voss, aged 58, retired solicitor, widower, and, depending on whom one consulted, either a well-regarded member of the community or a man who had made rather more enemies than was strictly comfortable for a village of 400 souls. He had lived alone in Hawthorne Cottage at the end of Mill Lane for the past 6 years, since the death of his wife, Patricia. He had attended the harvest supper every year without exception. He had eaten his lamb fricassee. He had drunk his elderflower cordial. He had spoken to several people in the course of the evening. And then, during the children's recitation, specifically during young Thomas Bellamy's rendering of Keats, he had gripped the edge of the table and made a sound that his neighbour, Mrs. Ruth Gallo, described as a short, surprised sort of exhalation, and had fallen sideways from his chair. Miss Marple had not been present at the harvest supper. She had, however, been present in Truiston for the preceding fortnight, staying with her niece's former schoolfellow, a Mrs. Frances Lee, who occupied a sensible Georgian house on the High Street, and who had been glad of the company since her husband's posting to Singapore. Miss Marple had come initially for a short rest, which she had found perfectly restorative, and had since found herself rather pleasantly absorbed by the village, its rhythms, its gossip, its intricate social topography, at which she was beginning to know with the particular intimacy that comes from sitting quietly in a great many rooms and listening with undivided attention. She heard about Gerald Voss the following morning from Mrs. Lee herself, who had attended the supper and returned home shaken. Frances Lee was a composed woman, not given to alarm, and the fact that her hands were still faintly unsteady as she poured the breakfast tea told Miss Marple a good deal more than the words themselves. "He was quite well earlier in the evening," Frances said, setting down the pot with excessive care. "I spoke to him myself, shortly after the grace. He seemed perfectly normal. A little quiet, perhaps, but Gerald was often quiet. He wasn't a man who made unnecessary conversation." "Did he eat and drink as the others did?" Miss Marple asked, which Frances acknowledged was an odd question for a Monday morning, but answered nonetheless. "I believe so, though I wasn't watching him particularly. One doesn't, does one?" She paused. "The police have been to the hall already. Someone said something about the glass, his glass." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "The elderflower cordial, I suppose, or perhaps the water. I really couldn't say." Frances looked up. "You don't think it was simply a heart attack?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that if it had simply been a heart attack, the police would not have gone to the hall about a glass." This observation sat between them for a moment, with the particular weight of things that are true and unwelcome. The investigation, such as it then was, or in those first cautious hours, was in the hands of Detective Inspector Arthur Rees of the County Constabulary, a careful, methodical man of 40-odd, who had worked 3 murders in his career, and wore that experience with a quiet seriousness that Miss Marple found herself respecting, though she had not yet met him. She had, however, met Constable Dayne, who had been stationed in Trueston for 2 years, and who came into Mrs. Lee's kitchen that afternoon on the pretext of asking whether Frances had noticed anything unusual during the supper, and who, as young constables will, in the presence of an attentive elderly lady and a plate of fresh shortbread, said rather more than he perhaps intended. It was from Constable Dayne that Miss Marple learned 3 things. First, that the post-mortem, while not yet complete, had found what the constable described as something in the stomach that wasn't right, by which, translated from the cautious vocabulary of officialdom, Miss Marple understood that the preliminary examination had suggested a substance requiring further analysis. Second, that Gerald Voss's glass had been found wiped clean, which was curious, as the other 22 glasses on the tables had not been wiped. Third, and this was the detail that stayed with her longest, sitting at the back of her mind with the quality of a misplaced stitch that one cannot quite leave alone, that the seating arrangement for the harvest supper was fixed each year, always the same. The chart was kept by Mrs. Doris Peele, who organized the hall with the precision of a general, and who had used the same seating plan for the past 4 years, making adjustments only for deaths and new arrivals. Gerald Voss had sat in the same chair for 4 years running. Anyone in Trueston who had attended a single harvest supper would have known precisely where he would be sitting. Miss Marple thought about this as she walked home along the High Street in the early evening light, past the post office with its hand-lettered notices, past the ironmongers, past the lich gate of St. Cuthbert's, where the parish hall sat quiet and locked behind its low stone wall. She thought about a glass that had been wiped, and a plate of food that could not be accounted for in the kitchen log, and a man who had sat in the same chair for 4 years. She thought in particular about the 23rd portion of lamb fricassee, the one that Doris Peele's careful record showed had never been prepared, if someone had known where Gerald Voss would sit. The question that followed from that The question that always followed, in Miss Marple's experience, from the fact of deliberate patient knowledge, was not merely who had wanted Gerald Voss dead. It was who had wanted it badly enough to plan. And those, she reflected, turning in at Mrs. Lee's gate as the last light faded from the copper beeches, were seldom the same answer. Chapter 2. What Doris Peele Remembered. The parish hall was reopened on Tuesday morning. Detective Inspector Rees had released it, having satisfied himself, or rather, having satisfied the preliminary requirements of an investigation that had not yet formally declared itself a murder inquiry, although everyone in Trueston understood perfectly well what it was, that whatever evidence the hall contained had either been collected or photographed or noted in the careful ledgers his constables carried. The cream linen tablecloths had gone with them. So had Gerald Voss's chair. The Women's Institute had booked the hall for its Tuesday meeting months in advance, and Mrs. Edith Crane, who chaired the Institute with the authority that municipal governments might reasonably have envied, had seen no reason to cancel. Life proceeded. That was Mrs. Crane's position on most things, and it had served her well for 71 years. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30, which was 20 minutes after the meeting had begun, and therefore, as she had calculated, precisely when the formal business of the agenda would be giving way to the less formal business of conversation. She had been invited by Mrs. Lee, who was a member, and she entered quietly and took a seat near the back beside a stout woman in a green cardigan who introduced herself as Mrs. Bet Halmshaw, and immediately offered a biscuit. Miss Marple accepted the biscuit. She was very fond of biscuits, and she found, moreover, that accepting small offerings from strangers created a warmth of atmosphere that was frequently more useful than any direct inquiry. Mrs. Crane was speaking at the front of the room about the autumn raffle, which was to benefit the church roof. She spoke with precision and without sentiment. Miss Marple noted that she had placed herself facing the hall doors rather than the window, which meant she had a clear view of every arrival. She had noted Miss Marple's entrance without appearing to. She was, Miss Marple thought, a woman who noticed a great deal and volunteered very little. Doris Peele sat in the second row, slightly apart from her neighbours in the way that people sit when they are conscious of being watched. She was a small, neat woman of 63, with grey hair cut close and hands that lay very still in her lap. The hands, Miss Marple thought, of someone exercising deliberate control. She had brought a notebook, which was open but in which nothing had yet been written. It was Frances Lee who introduced them during the interval in the small anteroom where the tea things were laid out. "Doris, this is my friend Miss Marple. She's been staying with me this fortnight." And then, because Frances was direct in the manner of women who have lived abroad and lost patience with indirection, "She's rather good at this sort of thing." This sort of thing. It was an interesting formulation, Miss Marple reflected, and one that generally preceded either a confession or a closing of doors. Doris Peele looked at her for a moment, a quiet, measuring look, and then said, "Would you like more tea?" They sat together near the window, and Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle comfortably before she spoke. "I understand you keep the seating arrangements for the supper," she said. "Not a question precisely." "I have done, yes, for the past 9 years." Doris Peele's voice was steady. "Oh, the police have already asked about that." "Of course they have. They would have been very remiss not to." Miss Marple set down her cup. "I was thinking less about the arrangement itself. and more about who might have been familiar with it. Whether it was the sort of thing generally known in the village, or whether it was information one would need to have sought out. Doris was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone was raking leaves in the churchyard, the sound carrying clearly through the old window glass. "It was posted," she said at last, "on the notice board in the hall entrance, 2 weeks before the supper." As it always is, she paused, so anyone might have seen it, anyone who walked through that door. "Which in a village the size of Truiston," Miss Marple said gently, "would be a considerable number of people." "Yes." A brief silence, though the plan itself didn't change much from year to year. Gerald, Mr. Voss, had sat in the same position since the year his wife died. He preferred the end of the table. He said it suited him. Something shifted fractionally in her expression. He was a man who knew what suited him. There was a quality to this observation that Miss Marple found interesting, not hostility precisely. Something more complicated than hostility. Something that had been worn smooth by time. "Had he any particular friends at the supper?" Miss Marple asked. "People he tended to sit near, speak with?" "His neighbours to either side." Doris recited them with the flat precision of a woman giving evidence. "Mrs. Ruth Gallo on his left, as always. On his right, this year, young Mr. and Peter Dayne, who only moved to the village in spring and was placed there because the plan had a gap. Before that, it had been Mr. Holloway, but Mr. Holloway moved away in August. And across the table. A fractional hesitation, barely perceptible. Mrs. Sylvia Voss." Miss Marple absorbed this without visible reaction. "His wife's sister?" she asked, because Frances had mentioned in passing that Gerald's late wife had a younger sister who had remained in the village. "His wife's cousin, actually, though they were close as sisters. Sylvia Marsh, she is now. She remarried in '68. Doris Peele lifted her teacup. She and Gerald were not on easy terms. Everyone knew it. It went back some years. Do you know what it concerned? There was some question about Patricia's estate. The words were careful, precise, slightly too neutral. I couldn't say more than that. It wasn't my business." Miss Marple thought that Doris Peele could almost certainly say considerably more than that, and had chosen not to, which was itself a kind of information. "The kitchen log," Miss Marple said, shifting direction with the unhurried ease of long practice. "The 22 portions. I heard something mentioned." And here, for the first time, something genuine moved across Doris Peele's face. Not quite alarm, closer to a tired recognition, the look of someone who had been waiting for a particular question, and was almost relieved to have it asked. "I counted everything myself," she said. "I always do. 22 portions prepared, 23 people seated." She set down her cup with great precision. "I noticed it that night, before Gerald was taken ill. I thought I had miscounted, and went back to check. I hadn't miscounted." "Did you tell the police this?" "They found the log themselves. They asked me about it this morning." She looked at her hands. "I told them what I've told you." "But something else occurred to you," Miss Marple said quietly. A long pause. "The portion," Doris said, "was already at the table when I came out of the kitchen with the first serving trolley. I thought one of the helpers had carried something out early, but when I asked afterwards, none of them had." She met Miss Marple's gaze directly for the first time. "I didn't see who put it there. Gerald's end of the table. It was simply there." The raking of leaves had stopped. The anteroom was very quiet. Miss Marple thought of a plate placed quietly at the end of a table, in a hall where the seating plan had been posted on the notice board for a fortnight. She thought of a glass wiped clean while 22 others remained untouched. She thought of Sylvia Marsh, seated directly across from a man with whom she was not on easy terms, watching him eat. And she thought, not for the first time, and not with any satisfaction, that whoever had planned this had planned it with the calm familiarity of someone who knew this village, this hall, and this particular man's habits as well as they knew their own. That was the most troubling thing, not the poison, if poison it was, the knowledge, the patient, ordinary, unremarkable knowledge of a neighbour. Chapter 3. The Man Nobody Mourned. Gerald Voss had not been popular. This was the kind of truth that a village arrives at collectively and carefully, in the days following a death, reassembling itself around the absence, testing what can now be said aloud that could not quite be said before. In Trueston, the reassembly happened quickly. By Tuesday afternoon, when Miss Marple walked the length of the High Street on the pretext of posting a letter she had heard Gerald Voss described in the space of 400 yards as difficult, precise, litigious, and, from the ironmonger's assistant, who was young enough to say things plainly, simply not very nice. None of this was said with malice. That was the interesting part. It was said with the mild, slightly relieved candour of people setting down something they had been carrying politely for a long time. Miss Marple posted her letter and stopped at the village shop for a small pot of honey, and while Mrs. Tabitha Norris wrapped it, she wrapped everything, regardless of whether wrapping was strictly necessary. She spoke about the weather, and the church roof, and the dreadful business of Saturday. And by the time the honey was packaged to Mrs. Norris's satisfaction, Miss Marple had learned that Gerald Voss had disputed his garden boundary with 3 separate neighbours in 6 years, had twice threatened legal action over matters the village considered trivial, and had, most recently, written a formal letter of objection to the parish council regarding the proposed expansion of the primary school car park, on grounds that the additional traffic would disturb the view from his sitting-room window. He was within his rights, of course, Mrs. Norris said, with the tone of someone conceding a point they find deeply irritating. He usually was within his rights. That was rather the trouble with him. Miss Marple agreed that being consistently within one's rights was a quality that could wear upon the nerves, and took her honey and walked on. The picture that assembled itself, block by careful block, over the course of that Tuesday, was of a man who had retreated into a certain cold precision following his wife's death, and had never quite retreated back. Patricia Voss, Patricia Hale as she had been, was remembered warmly, which threw her husband's subsequent manner into sharper relief. She had been the softening element people implied without quite saying. With her gone, the angles had shown. There was, however, one complication to the simple portrait of a difficult man universally disliked. His name was Tom Ashby. If Miss Marple heard it first from Francis that evening, over supper, and heard it again the following morning from Constable Dayne, who arrived once more on the stated pretext of official inquiry, and the unstated pretext of the shortbread tin, which Francis had replenished. Tom Ashby was 31, unmarried, and worked the small mixed farm on the eastern edge of the village that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before him. He was, by general account, a quiet and capable young man who had been in considerable financial difficulty 18 months ago, following a bad season and a broken tractor that had required replacement at a cost the farm could not easily absorb. Gerald Voss had lent him the money, not given. lent with terms written up in the formal language that a retired solicitor applied to all things, and even kindnesses. But lent, and at an interest rate that several people described as fair, which in the context of Gerald Voss was apparently remarkable enough to be noted. "He was fond of Tom," Frances said, passing the bread. "In his way, which wasn't a demonstrative way, but you could see it if you knew what to look for. Tom used to come round to Hawthorne Cottage on Sunday afternoons sometimes. They'd play chess. Gerald taught him." She paused. "Tom's been very quiet since Saturday. Not the quiet of shock exactly. Something else." Miss Marple considered this. Had the loan been repaid? Partly, I think. Tom was making payments. There was no difficulty there, as far as anyone knew. And Tom's relationship with Gerald, with anyone else in Gerald's circle, with Sylvia Marsh, for instance. Frances looked up. Now why would you ask about Sylvia specifically?" "She was seated across from him at the supper," Miss Marple said, "and Doris Peele mentioned their relations were not easy." "That's a generous description." Frances set down her fork. Sylvia believed Gerald had influenced Patricia's will. Patricia left almost everything to a hospice charity, a place in Dorset where she'd received care before she died. Very little came to Sylvia, who had expected more. She blamed Gerald entirely. She told people so, which in a village means everyone knew within a fortnight. And was she correct? Did Gerald influence the will? He drew it up. He was a solicitor, and she was his wife, so naturally he drew it up. Whether he influenced it, Frances shrugged slightly. Patricia was not a woman easily influenced. But that's not how Sylvia chose to remember it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She was forming, as she often did in the early stages of these things, a kind of internal map, not of suspects precisely, which was too orderly a concept for what was still, in places, fog, but of relationships, their tensions and textures, the weight each one carried. Gerald Voss, precise, isolated, not liked, but not without connection. Patricia's absence still shaping the village's sense of him 6 years on. Sylvia Marsh, aggrieved vocal, seated directly across from the dead man at the table where he died. Tom Ashby, indebted, cared for, quiet in a way that suggested not shock, but something heavier. And then there was the question of Peter Dayne, who had sat to Gerald's right, the position formerly occupied by the departed Mr. Holloway, and about whom Miss Marple knew almost nothing. Which was itself, she had learned over many years, a kind of information. The people one knew least about in the early stages of an inquiry were frequently the people most worth knowing. She mentioned this to Constable Dayne on Wednesday morning, with sufficient indirection that it did not sound like an instruction. "Mr. Dayne," Dayne said, accepting a second piece of shortbread with the ease of a man who had stopped pretending he came for official reasons. "Yes, he moved into the Holloway place in March. Works remotely. Some sort of computer work, I believe. Keeps to himself mostly. Inspector Rees has spoken with him." He paused in the way that people pause when they are deciding how much more to say. "He did mention something, Mr. Dayne. That during the supper, before Mr. Voss was taken ill. Mr. Voss had seemed distracted, checking his watch, looking towards the door." "As though expecting someone?" Miss Marple asked. "Or not expecting them and wondering why they hadn't arrived?" Dayne frowned at his shortbread. "Which amounts to the same thing, I suppose, but feels different." "It feels considerably different," Miss Marple agreed. "Did anyone fail to attend the supper who was expected to?" Dayne shifted slightly in his chair. "That's the thing. Mrs. Crane's register, she keeps a register of RSVPs very thorough, showed one confirmed guest who didn't appear on the night. Man called Holroyd, Leonard Holroyd, runs the small accountancy practice above the post office. And his reason for not attending. Said he was unwell. Sent a note round to Mrs. Crane on Saturday afternoon. A pause, as Inspector Reese thought nothing of it particularly. People do fall ill. Miss Marple looked out the kitchen window at the garden, where the last of the October roses were making their quiet, diminished stand against the season. She thought about a man checking his watch, looking toward the door, waiting for someone who had sent a note to say he was unwell. She thought about an accountant and a solicitor and a farmer with a loan. She thought about how, in her experience, the connections between people were rarely as simple as money, but were rarely entirely without it either. "I should very much like to meet Mr. Holroyd," she said pleasantly, to no one in particular. Constable Dayne looked at her with the expression of a young man who is beginning to understand that certain elderly ladies are considerably more dangerous than they appear, and he did not say this. He finished his shortbread, thanked Mrs. Lee, and took his leave. But he left the door slightly open, which Miss Marple found, in its small way, rather encouraging. Chapter 4. The accountant's closed door. Leonard Holroyd's office occupied the upper floor of a narrow Georgian building on the north side of the High Street, accessible by a steep internal staircase, and announced by a small brass plate beside the post office entrance that read, L. Holroyd, chartered accountant in lettering so discreet it might have been intended to discourage rather than attract. Miss Marple noticed the plate on Wednesday morning and filed it carefully in her mind, alongside everything else she had collected about Trueston in the past fortnight. The way the village turned its face to strangers, and the particular silences that collected around certain names, the fact that the brass plate, unlike everything else on that stretch of the High Street, had not been polished recently. There was a thin film of autumn damp across it. A week's worth, she estimated, perhaps slightly more. She did not go upstairs that morning. Instead, she went to the small tea-room on the south side of the street, which was run by a woman named Janet Fell, and which served excellent scones and weak tea, and functioned, as such establishments always do in English villages, as a kind of informal clearinghouse for everything the village knew and was prepared to say in a semi-public setting. Miss Marple ordered a scone and settled in the window seat and waited, with the patience of a woman who had long understood that information, like buses, he arrived more reliably when one stopped actively pursuing it. Janet Fell arrived with the scone and lingered, which was what Miss Marple had anticipated. Dreadful business, Janet said, straightening a napkin holder that did not require straightening. Gerald Voss, I mean. Though I suppose one oughtn't to say dreadful if one didn't particularly, well. She stopped, reconsidered. He came in here every Thursday for his morning coffee. Regular as the church clock. Black coffee, no sugar, the newspaper, and absolutely no conversation unless he initiated it, which was rarely. A pause. I shall miss his Thursday custom. I shan't especially miss him, and I'm not sure that's a terrible thing to admit, given the circumstances. Given the circumstances, Miss Marple agreed gently. Her honesty seems more respectful than false grief. Janet relaxed slightly. He'd been in here the Thursday before he died, the week before the supper, and he was different that morning, not his usual self at all. He initiated conversation, which, as I said, was not his habit. Asked me whether I knew if Leonard Holroyd had been in recently. Miss Marple spread cream on her scone with the unhurried precision she brought to most activities. And had he? Not for a fortnight, I told him. Leonard usually comes in on Tuesdays. Hadn't been in 2 Tuesdays running. Janet frowned. Gerald seemed, I don't know how to put it exactly, not alarmed. More as if something he'd suspected had been confirmed. Did he say anything further? Just that he supposed Leonard had been busy, but he said it in a way that meant he didn't suppose that at all. Janet picked up the napkin holder and put it down again in exactly the same position. They'd had dealings, Gerald and Leonard. Everyone knew it vaguely. Leonard did Gerald's accounts for years. And for Tom Ashby's farm, come to that. He does accounts for most of the village one way or another. That's the thing about a small place. There's only one of everything. So everybody's connected to everybody through the one person who does the thing. Miss Marple found this observation genuinely insightful, and said so, which pleased Janet considerably. She finished her scone in a thoughtful silence, and walked back along the high street toward the post office. This time she stopped at the brass plate, considered it for a moment, and climbed the stairs, and the door at the top was closed. She knocked, a pause, slightly too long to be natural, and then footsteps. The door opened. Leonard Holroyd was 54, of medium height, with the build of a man who had been heavier some years ago and had lost the weight without quite losing the manner of carrying it. He had careful eyes and hands that Miss Marple noticed immediately were entirely still, the deliberate stillness of someone who had prepared for this encounter, or something like it. Miss Marple, he said without apparent surprise, which was itself surprising, as she had not previously met him. Mr. Holroyd, she said pleasantly, you know my name. Francis Lee's guest. It's a small village. He stood back from the door. Please, come in. The office was orderly in the manner of a room that had been recently tidied rather than naturally organized. There were gaps on the shelves where files had been removed or rearranged. The desk held a single open ledger and a cup of tea that had stopped steaming some time ago. He had not, she thought, been working when she knocked. He had been waiting. I imagine, she said, settling into the offered chair with the ease of someone entirely comfortable with direct speech, that you've been expecting a visit from someone. I'm perhaps not quite what you anticipated. I expected Inspector Reese again. His voice was measured, controlled, not, Miss Marple noted, hostile. He came Monday, asked about Saturday, about your absence, about my absence. He sat behind the desk and folded his hands. I was unwell. I sent a note to Edith Crane. I remained at home, alone. A fractional pause. Yes, Mr. Holroyd, Miss Marple said, not unkindly. I should tell you that I am not here in any official capacity whatsoever. I am a visitor in this village, staying with a friend, and I am, I confess, constitutionally unable to leave puzzling things alone. It is not always an admirable quality. She paused. But I think you are carrying something rather heavy. And in my experience, that particular weight does not become lighter with time. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that takes the measure of a person carefully and without pretense. Gerald contacted me 3 weeks before the supper, he said finally, a formal letter. He had noticed certain discrepancies. In accounts he had asked me to prepare in connection with Tom Ashby's loan. He stopped. Gerald had structured the loan carefully, as he did everything. The repayment schedule, the terms. He kept copies of everything naturally. When he reviewed them last month against the records I had provided, which I had provided to him, and also separately to Tom, as the borrower, he found that the figures did not agree. Miss Marple was quiet, waiting. I had been— Holroyd pressed his folded hands more firmly together. I had adjusted certain figures, Tom's repayments, making them appear in my records as lower than they actually were. He said it with the flat tone of a man who has rehearsed the confession, and found that rehearsal does not make it easier. Tom had been paying correctly. I was retaining the difference. How much? Over how long? 14 months, approximately £900 in total. And Gerald's letter? Said he had found the discrepancy and wished to discuss it privately before deciding how to proceed. He said he had not yet spoken to Tom or to anyone else. A pause. He suggested we meet at the supper, briefly, after the meal, or that I come to the hall. But you didn't come. I was frightened. The words arrived without decoration. I sent the note saying I was ill. I spent Saturday evening at home, telling myself it would somehow resolve. He looked up. And then Sunday morning, Francis Lee's kitchen light came on at 6 o'clock, which in a village means something has happened, and by 7 I knew Gerald was dead. The room was very quiet. Miss Marple thought about a man who had found a discrepancy and proposed a private meeting, but who had been observed checking his watch and looking toward the door, who had, by his own habit of caution and privacy, arranged to resolve an unpleasant matter quietly, without witnesses. Someone had known about that letter, or had known that Gerald Voss, thorough and precise as he was, had recently found something he ought not to have found. "Mr. Holroyd," she said carefully, "did you tell anyone about Gerald's letter before Saturday?" His stillness deepened. "No," he said. "Then I don't believe so." It was that final qualification, small, involuntary, that stayed with Miss Marple all the way down the steep stairs and back out into the pale October street. I don't believe so. Not a denial, a hope. Chapter 5. Sylvia Marsh takes her tea. Sylvia Marsh lived in a stone cottage on Wren Lane, which ran parallel to the High Street, and was connected to it by 2 narrow passages that the village called ginnels, and which had no lighting, and smelled pleasantly of old brick and damp ivy. The cottage had window boxes that still held the remnants of summer geraniums, gone brown and brittle at the edges, and a front door painted a particular shade of dark red that Miss Marple associated with people who wished to appear more decisive than they felt. She had arranged the visit through Francis, who had telephoned Sylvia Marsh on Wednesday evening with the straightforward explanation that her house-guest was keen to meet more of the village, which was true enough to serve the purpose. Sylvia had agreed to Thursday morning tea with a readiness that Miss Marple found instructive. A woman with nothing particular on her mind might have agreed readily. A woman with a great deal on her mind, and nowhere comfortable to put it, might have agreed with precisely the same readiness, for entirely different reasons. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30 carrying a small pot of the honey she had purchased from Mrs. Norris, which served the double purpose of being a genuine courtesy, and of establishing, from the first moment, a tone of ordinary sociable visiting that she found useful. Sylvia Marsh opened the door before the knocker had quite finished sounding, which confirmed that she had been listening for it. She was 61, dark-haired in a way that owed something to assistance, with a face that had been striking in youth, and had become, in middle age, something more interesting, sharper, more knowing, and with fine lines around the eyes that suggested a great deal of habitual observation. She was dressed more carefully than a Thursday morning at home strictly required, and her sitting-room, when she led Miss Marple into it, had the particular arranged quality of a space that had been tidied specifically for this occasion rather than generally maintained. On the mantelpiece, between a carriage clock and a small blue vase, was a photograph of two women. One was Sylvia, considerably younger. The other fair-haired and smiling toward the camera with the ease of someone entirely comfortable being seen, Miss Marple took to be Patricia Voss. She did not remark on the photograph immediately. She accepted her tea, admired the window boxes with genuine sympathy for the geraniums, and allowed Sylvia to lead the conversation through its preliminary movements. The weather, Francis Lee's house, the general inconvenience of village life, combined with its equally general consolations, until the preliminary movements had run their natural course. Then Sylvia said with the abruptness of someone releasing a held breath, "I suppose you want to talk about Gerald." "I find I'm always interested in people I haven't had the chance to meet," Miss Marple said, which was true and sufficiently ambiguous. Sylvia set down her cup. He wasn't an easy man to know. Most people in this village would tell you they didn't know him, and I think they'd be correct, even the ones who thought they did. She paused. "I knew him for 34 years, since before he married Patricia. I don't think I knew him either." "Your cousin," Miss Marple said. "Patricia. My cousin, yes." Something moved briefly across Sylvia's face. Grief, old and worn smooth, but genuine beneath its smoothness. "We were as close as sisters. Closer in some ways than sisters are. I introduced her to Gerald, which is one of those facts I have spent a good deal of time trying to decide how to feel about." "Did you dislike him from the beginning?" "I was wary of him from the beginning, which is different." Sylvia turned her teacup in its saucer with a slow, deliberate rotation. Gerald was a man who organized things, people and situations and arrangements. He was very good at it and found it very natural. Patricia found it reassuring for a long time. She had been uncertain as a young woman. Gerald's certainty was attractive to her, she paused. Later, I think, she found it less reassuring. But by then it was simply the shape of the life she had. "And the will," Miss Marple said gently. A brief silence. "The will." Sylvia looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "Patricia left almost everything to the Dorset Hospice, which is where she died, and which cared for her with extraordinary kindness, and which she had every right to benefit if she chose." Her voice was precise, as though she had said these words before, had rehearsed their fairness. "I don't dispute Patricia's intentions. I dispute Gerald's management of them." "You believe he influenced what she decided?" "I believe he sat beside her for every conversation she had with the solicitor, a colleague of his from his previous practice in Exeter. I'm not a local man. And that Patricia was very ill by that stage, and very tired, and very grateful to Gerald for managing things as he always had. And I believe that gratitude and exhaustion together are not the same as a free and uninfluenced decision." She stopped. "I cannot prove it. I said as much to a solicitor of my own when it was over. He told me I had grounds for concern, but not for a challenge." A pause. Gerald knew precisely what he was doing. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, considering this carefully. It was, she thought, an account delivered with reasonable fairness. The anger was present, but had been disciplined over time into something more measured. It had the texture of truth, or at least of genuine belief, which was not always the same thing, but was worth distinguishing. "You were seated across from him at the supper," Miss Marple said. "I was, as I have been for 4 years, because Doris Peele puts the seating plan together with the logic of a train timetable, and no one moves unless they die or leave the village." A dry note in her voice, immediately followed by a brief involuntary tightening of expression at the word die. "I did not request a different seat. I considered it and decided it would look pointed. Did you speak to him during the evening? Briefly, during the soup course. He asked after my garden, I asked after his. We established that both gardens were managing adequately. It was the conversation we always had. We had developed, over 4 years of harvest suppers, a perfectly serviceable cordiality. She looked at Miss Marple directly. I did not like him. I will not pretend otherwise. But I had no wish to sit opposite a man's empty chair for whatever years remained to me either. That is not a comfortable thing to wish on oneself. Did you notice anything unusual during the meal? Anything about the food, the drinks, anyone moving between tables? Sylvia was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than evasive. There was one thing, she said. I noticed it and thought nothing of it at the time. Shortly before the children's recitation began, perhaps 10 minutes before, I saw someone come in through the side door. The door that connects directly to the kitchen passage, not the main entrance. She paused. They didn't come fully into the hall. They stood in the doorway for a moment. I had a sideways view. And the lighting at that end of the hall is not good. And then they stepped back and the door closed. Miss Marple set down her cup very carefully. Could you identify them? Not with any certainty. The impression I had was of someone in a dark coat, standing still as though looking across the hall, and then gone. She frowned. I told myself it was someone arriving late, and then thinking better of it. A guest who decided the evening was too far advanced to join. But you're not certain of that. I'm not certain of anything. Sylvia looked at the geraniums in their boxes, brittle against the October light. That is rather the difficulty with all of it. Nothing I can tell you is certain, yet everything is impression and inference, and the particular knowledge of someone who has watched this village and the people in it for 30 years. She turned back. Is that useful to you? In my experience, Miss Marple said, impression and inference from someone who has watched carefully for 30 years is frequently more useful than certainty from someone who has watched for 30 minutes. She rose, thanking Sylvia for the tea. One last thing. The person at the side door, the dark coat. Could you say anything at all about their height, their build? Sylvia considered carefully. Not tall, middling height, and something about the way they stood. Quite still, quite deliberate. She paused. Patient, I would say. If you can say such a thing about someone you glimpsed for a moment in a doorway. But they looked patient. Miss Marple walked home through the ginnel, her footsteps quiet on the old stone, thinking about patience, about figures in doorways, about a side entrance that connected directly to the kitchen passage, and a portion of lamb fricassee that had appeared at Gerald Voss's place before the serving trolley had left the kitchen. The figure had not been arriving late. They had, she thought, been checking that everything was in order. Chapter 6. Tom Ashby's Fields. The Ashby farm sat at the eastern edge of Truiston, where the village released its grip on itself gradually, the cottages thinning, the gardens widening into paddock, but the tarmac giving way at last to a packed earth track rutted by tractor tires and bordered on both sides by hedgerows that had been growing in their own direction for several decades without significant interference. Miss Marple walked it on Thursday afternoon. She had not arranged this visit in advance, which was a deliberate choice. Arranged visits produced arranged people. Rooms tidied, expressions composed, answers prepared. Unannounced arrivals produced something more valuable, which was the particular texture of a person in their natural state, before the performance of it had been assembled. She had brought as a reason for being there at all a small jar of chutney that Frances had been meaning to deliver to Tom Ashby for some weeks. and which now served as Miss Marple's passport to a farmyard on a Thursday afternoon. And she heard him before she saw him. The sound was a steady rhythmic splitting of wood, clean and unhurried, coming from behind the barn that stood to the left of the main farmhouse. She followed it around the corner and found Tom Ashby standing before a low chopping block, working through a considerable stack of oak logs with the methodical patience of a man who has discovered that physical work is the most reliable form of not thinking. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, with the particular leanness of outdoor labour rather than intent. His face, when he turned at her approach, was younger than she had expected. Early 30s, she confirmed, with dark eyes that were direct but currently carrying a weight behind them. That directness alone could not quite conceal. He had not shaved that morning. Perhaps not the morning before, either, Miss Marple, he said, and she had the same mild surprise she had felt with Holroyd, the village knowing her name before she had offered it. She supposed Francis had mentioned her widely, or the village had simply assembled the information itself, as villages do. Mr. Ashby. She held out the chutney with a genuine smile. Francis has been meaning to bring this for weeks. I volunteered myself, partly because I wanted the walk, and partly because I find farms in October rather beautiful, and don't need much excuse to visit one. He looked at the chutney as though he had briefly forgotten what ordinary transactions between people looked like, then took it with a murmured thanks and set it on the chopping block. He did not pick up the axe again. Instead, he stood with his hands at his sides in the manner of a man who has run out of the task he was using as an anchor. "Shall we go in?" he said, which was not quite a question. The farmhouse kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and the particular honest smell of a working kitchen, where cooking happens out of necessity rather than performance. There was a collie asleep under the table, which raised one eyebrow at Miss Marple, and lowered it again, apparently satisfied. Tom filled the kettle and set it on the range with the automatic movements of a man doing familiar things in an unfamiliar state of mind. "You were fond of Gerald Voss," Miss Marple said, once they were seated with their tea. It was not a question. He looked at her with those direct, weighted eyes. "Yes," he said simply, "despite the loan. Or perhaps because of it. The loan was—" He stopped, started again. "Gerald could have had me sign something that would have given him this farm if I'd missed 2 consecutive payments. He'd seen farmers ruined that way, he said. He could have protected himself completely. Instead, he wrote terms that were firm but fair, and gave me 18 months before the first repayment was due." He turned his mug slowly on the table. "That was not how people described him to you, I imagine." "Not precisely," Miss Marple admitted, "but the people who described him were not the people he had chosen to help." Something shifted in Tom Ashby's face at this, a fractional release of tension, as though a small thing he had been holding had been acknowledged by someone else and could be set down. He wasn't kind in any obvious way. He didn't make it comfortable. He made it formal and correct and slightly uncomfortable, actually. But the thing underneath was decent. He paused. "I've been trying to find the right word for 3 days, and that's the best I can do. Decent." Miss Marple thought this was quite a good word for it. "You played chess together," she said, "Sunday afternoons, 3 years, almost since I moved back from Exeter to take over the farm after my father died. Gerald had lived here his whole adult life. He knew my father slightly. He came to the funeral." Tom's hands wrapped around the mug. "He never explained why he started inviting me. Just appeared one Sunday with a board and said he had nobody to play with, and did I know the game, I barely did. He taught me properly. A pause. I beat him for the first time about a year ago, and he was genuinely pleased, not pretending. He said it meant he had taught me correctly. The collie shifted under the table. Outside the kitchen window, the October fields lay in their flat autumn colours, grey and amber, and the dark brown of turned earth. "Tom," Miss Marple said, with the quiet directness she employed when peripheral approaches had served their purpose, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I am asking because I believe the answer matters, not because I suspect you of anything." He looked at her steadily. "Ask." "Did you know that Gerald had found discrepancies in Leonard Holroyd's accounts, the accounts connected to your loan?" The stillness that followed was not the stillness of surprise. It was something more complicated. The stillness of a person encountering a thing they had been approaching carefully from a distance, and had not quite expected to meet this soon. "He wrote to me," Tom said after a moment, 2 weeks before the supper. "Said he had found something troubling in the records, and wished to speak with me before he decided how to proceed. He said I should not contact Leonard in the meantime." He looked down at his mug. "He didn't tell me what, exactly, just that it concerned the repayment records. I worked out the rest myself, well enough." "Were you angry? With Gerald?" He shook his head. "With Leonard? Yes, considerably." His jaw tightened briefly. I had been paying correctly, every month, on time. If Leonard had been taking the difference, that was— He stopped. "Yes, I was angry. And did you contact Leonard, despite Gerald's instruction?" A pause, longer than the others. The collie made a small sound in its sleep. "I went to his office," Tom said carefully, "the Tuesday before the supper. I didn't go in. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for about 5 minutes, and then I walked away." He met her eyes. "I decided Gerald had asked me to wait, and Gerald had earned the right to be trusted on that." Miss Marple absorbed this. The visit that had not happened. The restraint. The 5 minutes at the bottom of a staircase that told her more about Tom Ashby's character than almost anything else he had said. "At the supper," she said, "you were seated to Gerald's right. Yes, we spoke during the first course. He seemed settled, I thought, not agitated. He said he intended to resolve the matter shortly, and that I was not to concern myself." Tom's voice had dropped slightly. "Those were almost his exact words. 'Do not concern yourself, Tom. It will be resolved.' And then, about an hour later, he was on the floor." He said this last sentence without drama, with a flatness that was worse than drama. "Did you notice," Miss Marple asked gently, "anything unusual during the meal? Anyone near Gerald's place, near his glass or his food, at any point during the evening?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table. The kettle began to murmur on the range. "There was a moment," he said slowly, "during the soup course. I'd got up to fetch more bread from the side table. It was directly behind us, against the wall. I was gone perhaps a minute." He paused. "When I came back, Gerald was talking to Ruth Gallo on his left. He hadn't noticed, but his glass had been moved." Miss Marple was very still. "Moved how?" "It had been on his right side, near me. It was back on his left when I returned." He looked up. "I assumed he'd shifted it himself, or Ruth had knocked it reaching for something and set it back." He paused. "I didn't think about it again until now." A minute's absence. A glass moved from one side to the other. Miss Marple looked out at the October fields and thought about someone patient enough to wait for exactly 1 minute, for the young man on the right to turn away, and quick enough to use it. The patience again. The same quality Sylvia Marsh had noticed in the figure at the doorway. Patient and precise, and entirely without hesitation. Somewhere at the back of her mind, the two things that had seemed separate were beginning, very quietly, to touch. Chapter 7. What the Side Door Knew. Miss Marple slept poorly on Thursday night. This was not unusual when a matter had reached the stage it had now reached. The stage where the separate threads had begun their first tentative convergence, where the fog was not yet lifted, but had thinned in places sufficiently to suggest the shapes beneath her. In her experience, the mind continued its work regardless of whether one was conscious and cooperative. And the results of that nocturnal industry were frequently waiting at the surface by morning, if one was patient enough to let them arrive, rather than reaching for them prematurely. She lay quietly in Francis Lee's spare bedroom and reviewed what she knew. A portion of food brought to the table from outside the kitchen, and placed at a seat that anyone familiar with Trueston's harvest supper would have known was Gerald Voss's. A glass moved during a 1-minute absence, shifted from right to left, from the side away from observation to the side nearest the man himself. A figure in a dark coat standing in the side doorway, patient, still checking, before withdrawing. A letter from Gerald to Leonard Holroyd, proposing a private meeting which Holroyd had evaded. A letter to Tom Ashby instructing him to wait. A man who had spent his last hour at a harvest table checking his watch and looking toward a door through which the one person who knew what he had discovered had chosen not to come. The side door. It was this detail, she thought, turning it carefully in her mind in the small hours of Friday morning, that had not been given sufficient attention, that Sylvia Marsh had seen someone stand in it. Tom Ashby had left the table for 60 seconds facing it. The plate of food had arrived before the kitchen trolley departed, which meant it had come from somewhere else entirely, and the side door, which connected the hall to the kitchen passage and also to the small car park at the rear of the building, was the only entry point that allowed access to the hall without passing the main entrance where Mrs. Crane stood with her register. By Friday morning, she had decided to look at the side door herself. The parish hall caretaker was a man named Mr. Albert Croft, who was 70 and had held the position for 18 years, and who approached his responsibilities with the mild territorial pride of someone who considers a public building to be, in all meaningful senses, his personal property. Miss Marple had encountered him briefly on Tuesday at the Women's Institute meeting, where he had hovered near the tea-urn with the expression of a man ensuring that no permanent damage was being done to his hall, and had formed the impression of someone who noticed everything that happened within his domain, and retained it with the accuracy of long habit. She found him on Friday morning raking leaves from the path beside the hall, which was not strictly a caretaker's responsibility, but which, she suspected, was how Mr. Croft preferred to spend Friday mornings regardless. She introduced herself properly this time, having previously only nodded at the tea-urn, and admired the hall's exterior stonework, which was genuinely admirable, and asked if she might see the side entrance that she'd heard mentioned in connection with the Saturday arrangements. Mr. Croft leaned his rake against the wall with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask the right question. The police looked at it Monday, he said, leading her around the side of the building along a narrow path of worn stone. Took photographs, asked me about the lock. He paused at the door, which was a solid oak affair with iron fittings, and produced from his coat pocket a ring of keys with the ease of a man for whom keys, are the primary expression of his authority. I told them what I'll tell you. The lock was not forced, not picked. It was opened with a key. Miss Marple examined the door with unhurried attention. It opened outward onto a small tarmacked area, perhaps 30 feet square, bounded on 2 sides by a low stone wall, and on the third by the rear of the post office building. A single overhead light on a rusted bracket. 3 painted lines on the tarmac indicating parking spaces, though the paint had faded to suggestion rather than instruction. "Who holds keys to this door?" she asked. "Myself, the vicar, Mrs. Crane, as chair of the hall committee. And there are 2 spares kept in the lockbox in my office for when the hall is hired." He paused with significance. Both spares were present and accounted for Monday morning. I checked myself before the police asked. So access on Saturday evening would have required one of the 3 personal keys. Or a copy of one. He said it with the flat precision of someone who has already thought this through and found it uncomfortable. A copy could be cut from any of the 3 originals. I couldn't speak to whether any of the holders had had copies made. He paused. "I have not. I want that understood." Miss Marple understood it and said so. She stood in the doorway, looking into the hall, positioning herself approximately where Sylvia Marsh had described the figure standing. From here, the sight line across the hall was clear, the horseshoe of tables entirely visible, Gerald Voss's position at the end of the left-hand table, directly in view. A person standing here in the shadowed doorway, with the hall lit and their own position dim, would have been able to observe the tables without being easily observed in return. She turned and looked outward at the small car park. "On Saturday evening," she said to Mr. Croft, who had remained discreetly nearby, "was this area lit? The overhead light has a sensor. Comes on after dark. It was functioning. I checked it that afternoon myself, as I always do before an evening event." He paused. "Though the sensor has a gap. The area directly against the hall wall to the left of the door falls outside the sensor's range. Has done for 2 years. I've reported it to the committee 3 times. A note of grievance entered his voice. "It remains on the list." Miss Marple looked at the area he indicated. A space perhaps 4 feet wide, running along the hall's rear wall, outside the sensor's range, invisible from the car park light, sheltered by the slight overhang of the roofline. A person standing there, waiting, would have been effectively invisible from outside. She thanked Mr. Croft and walked slowly around to the high street, thinking about keys, and visibility, and the particular geometry of preparation, the way someone had mapped this space, measured its blind spots, calculated its gaps, and used them with the confidence of someone thoroughly familiar with the ground. This was not opportunistic. Nothing about this had been opportunistic. She stopped at the post office to buy a stamp she did not especially need, and found herself standing at the small notice board inside the entrance, where community announcements were pinned in overlapping layers. Beneath a notice about the autumn raffle, and above a faded advertisement for a piano teacher, the harvest supper seating plan was still pinned, overlooked in the aftermath of events not yet removed. She studied it carefully. 23 names. A horseshoe arrangement rendered in Doris Peele's neat handwriting, our Gerald Voss at the end of the left table. Tom Ashby to his right, Ruth Gallo to his left. Sylvia Marsh directly opposite. And 3 positions away from Sylvia Marsh, on the outer arm of the horseshoe, partially obscured by the raffle notice so that she almost missed it, the empty space marked with a small penciled cross, and the name L. the Holroyd, where Leonard Holroyd had been expected to sit and had not. Miss Marple stood very still. Leonard Holroyd's assigned seat had a clear, unobstructed view of Gerald Voss's position. She mapped it mentally. The angle, the distance, the sightlines between them. From that seat, a person would have been able to observe Gerald throughout the evening with perfect ease, and without appearing to do so at all. A seat that had been empty all evening. A seat that had been empty because the person assigned to it had sent a note claiming illness, and remained at home, or claimed to have remained at home, while Gerald Voss had spent an hour watching the door through which that person had promised, implicitly, to come. But Holroyd had said he had told no one about Gerald's letter. I don't believe so. She thought of that small qualification, and of the gap in the car park light, and of a key that had opened a lock without force, and of the particular patience of someone who had stood in a doorway, checking that everything was correctly arranged. Then she thought of a rather different possibility, one that shifted the whole picture slightly, the way a lens shifts when adjusted by a single degree, bringing what had been blurred to an uncomfortable clarity. Or what if Holroyd's absence had not been the plan? What if someone had ensured Holroyd would not be there, had known he would not come, had relied upon his absence, had perhaps even arranged it? Because an empty seat, 3 positions from Sylvia Marsh, provided not a vantage point for observation, but a gap in the room's attention. A hole in the social fabric of the evening through which a person could move, unnoticed, precisely because everyone who might have seen them was looking at the place where someone expected was conspicuously not. She walked home through the thin October sunshine. The letter, she thought, Gerald's letter to Holroyd proposing a meeting. If someone else had known about that letter, had read it, or been told of it, they would have known 2 things simultaneously: that Gerald had found the discrepancy, and that Gerald intended to resolve it privately, at the supper, in conversation with the one man who could confirm what had happened. Remove Holroyd from the supper, and you remove Gerald's witness. Remove Gerald from the equation entirely, and you remove the threat itself. Miss Marple turned in at Francis Lee's gate, and stood for a moment in the front garden with her hand on the latch, looking at nothing in particular. She was beginning to understand, she thought, not merely what had happened, but the quality of the mind that had arranged it. Its patience, yes, its familiarity with the ground, but also something else, something that distinguished this from the ordinary calculations of fear or greed or grievance. Whoever had done this had understood people, had known how they would behave, where they would look, and when they would turn away. Had read the room, this village, this hall, this particular evening, the way a chess player reads a board. Gerald Voss, she remembered, had taught Tom Ashby chess. She wondered who had taught Gerald. Chapter 8. Letters in the Dead Man's House. Detective Inspector Rees came to Francis Lee's house on Friday afternoon. This was not entirely unexpected. Miss Marple had formed the impression, from Constable Denny's increasingly liberal dispensation of information over the shortbread tin, that Inspector Rees was a man who gathered intelligence from multiple directions simultaneously, and was perfectly aware that one of those directions ran through Francis Lee's kitchen. That he had come himself. Rather than sending Denny again, he suggested that the investigation had reached a stage where the informal channel had become worth formalizing. He was younger than she had imagined from Denny's descriptions. 42 or 43, with a thin, patient face and the slightly worn quality of a man who takes his work home with him, not from lack of discipline, but from genuine investment. He accepted tea and declined shortbread, which told Miss Marple something about the degree of his preoccupation. People in genuine professional difficulty, she had observed, frequently forgot to eat. "Miss Marple," he said with the directness of a man who had decided that indirection would cost more time than it saved. "Constable Dayne tells me you've spoken with Leonard Holroyd, Tom Ashby, Sylvia Marsh, and Doris Peele, and Janet Fell at the tea-room, and Albert Croft at the hall." "I've been getting to know the village," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Quite." A brief, not unkind pause. "I wonder if you'd be willing to share what you've gathered, in the interest of efficiency." Miss Marple considered him for a moment. She had dealt with policemen of various attitudes toward elderly civilian interference over the course of her long experience, and had learned to distinguish fairly quickly between those who considered her a nuisance to be managed and those who were capable of the more useful recognition that she had spoken to people they had not, and extracted things they hadn't. Rees, she judged, belonged to the second category. He had come on a Friday afternoon rather than sending a constable, which was its own form of courtesy. She told him, therefore, about the side door and Mr. Keycroft's observation regarding the censor gap. She told him what Tom Ashby had said about the glass being moved during his 60-second absence from the table. She told him what Sylvia Marsh had seen in the doorway, the patient figure, the dark coat, the stillness. She told him about Leonard Holroyd's admission and his final qualification. She did not tell him her more recent thinking, regarding the geometry of the empty seat and the question of who had known about Gerald's letter to Holroyd, because those were still thoughts rather than evidence, and Inspector Rees struck her as a man who valued the distinction. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and made notes in a small book with the quiet efficiency of someone capturing exactly what matters and leaving the rest. "The post-mortem is confirmed," he said, was when she had finished. "Arsenic, a substantial dose, delivered in the cordial, we believe, based on the glass residue. The glass had been wiped, as you know, but not thoroughly enough. There were trace amounts on the interior base." He paused. "We're working to determine when and how the arsenic was introduced. The cordial was served from a shared jug at each table. No other guests exhibited symptoms." "Which means it was introduced into Gerald's glass specifically," Miss Marple said, "rather than the jug." "Correct. Either before the cordial was poured or immediately after." He looked at his notes. "Tom Ashby's account of the glass being moved is new. That's useful." "There is one other thing," Miss Marple said. "Gerald's house, Hawthorne Cottage. Have you found his copy of the letter he wrote to Holroyd?" "We found a copy, yes. Dated the 14th of October, formally worded, described the discrepancy in general terms without specifying the exact figures." He paused. "We also found a second letter, addressed to Tom Ashby, as you indicated. But in the course of searching the study, we found something else, something that may be rather more significant." He said this with the careful neutrality of a man releasing a piece of information he has been carrying alone for a day or two. Miss Marple waited. "Gerald Voss kept a journal," Rees said. "Not a diary in the personal sense, more of a professional record. He had kept one since his retirement, apparently as a habit from his working life, documenting conversations, observations, matters he considered worth noting. He opened his own notebook to a page where he had made a longer entry. Mourn, the most recent entries cover the past 6 weeks. He had become concerned, he wrote, not only about Holroyd's accounting irregularities, but about what he suspected lay behind them. "He thought the irregularities were not Holroyd's idea," Miss Marple said. Rees looked at her with an expression that acknowledged she had arrived at the same place he had. "He wrote that Holroyd, in his professional assessment, lacked both the nerve and the motive for sustained financial deception of that kind. He described Holroyd as, and this is Gerald's own phrasing, a careful man made careless by pressure from a direction I have not yet fully identified. He wrote that he intended to establish the source of that pressure before the meeting he had proposed. Did he record any suspicions about the direction? Obliquely. He wrote about a conversation he had had in September with a man he referred to only by initials, PD. Rees looked up. Peter Dayne, the man who moved into the village in March, and who sat to Gerald's right at the supper. The name had been waiting, Miss Marple reflected, at the edge of her thinking since Tuesday. The newcomer about whom she knew least, the empty space in her map. What did Gerald write about him? He wrote that Dayne had approached him in September with a business proposition. Something involving investment in a property development outside the village. Gerald had declined, but noted that Dayne seemed to have detailed knowledge of the financial situations of several village residents, which Gerald found curious for a man who had lived in Trewiston only 6 months. A pause. He wrote that he intended to make inquiries about Dayne's background. The final journal entry, 3 days before the supper, reads only, "PD is not what he has represented himself to be. I will know the full extent of it by Monday." The kitchen was very quiet. Miss Marple thought about Peter Dayne, who worked remotely at some unspecified computer occupation, who had moved into the village in March, who had been seated by chance, by the neutral operation of Doris Peele's seating plan, filling the gap left by Holloway's departure, directly beside Gerald Voss. And who had, apparently, approached Gerald with a financial proposition that Gerald had declined. She thought about the particular type of person who moves into a small village and rapidly acquires detailed knowledge of the financial vulnerabilities of its residents, which she thought about Leonard Holroyd, a careful man made careless by pressure from a direction I have not yet fully identified, and about the £900 extracted from Tom Ashby's loan repayments, and about what such a relatively small sum might represent in a larger pattern. Not theft for its own sake. A demonstration of capability. Leverage. Has Inspector Rees spoken with Peter Dayne since Sunday? Miss Marple asked. I have spoken with him twice, Rees said. He is cooperative, well-spoken, provides clear answers to direct questions. He describes Gerald as a pleasant neighbour with whom he had limited acquaintance. A pause, carrying some weight. He is also, and this we established yesterday through the national database, not a computer consultant. His stated occupation does not correspond to any verifiable employment history. He has 3 previous addresses in the past 4 years, none for longer than 11 months. And his real name, as far as we have been able to establish, is not Peter Dayne. Miss Marple set down her teacup. He is still in the village, she asked. He was, as of this morning. Rees closed his notebook. We are moving carefully. We do not yet have sufficient evidence for an arrest, and a man of this type, pressed prematurely, will simply disappear, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes. She looked at the window where the afternoon light was beginning its early October retreat toward evening. She thought about Gerald Voss in his study, writing careful journal entries about a man he had identified as dangerous, intending to know the full extent of it by Monday, and about a man who had known Gerald would reach that full extent before Monday, and had acted accordingly. About a chess player who had surveyed the board and moved first. "Inspector Rees," she said, "I think there may be a way to ensure he does not disappear before you have what you need. But it will require gathering several people together in one room, which is not something I suggest lightly. And it will require," she paused, "that you permit an elderly lady to ask a few questions before you make any formal move." Rees regarded her for a long moment. He did not say no. He picked up his notebook again, and this time, Miss Marple noticed, he also accepted a piece of shortbread. Chapter 9. The Weight of Small Things. Saturday arrived in Truiston with the particular quality of a day that does not know what it is carrying. The sky was low and uniformly grey. The kind that settles over English villages in mid-October and remains without drama or development, not threatening rain precisely, simply removing the option of anything else. The high street was quiet. The post office opened at its usual hour. Mrs. Norris arranged her window display. The church clock marked 9, then past, with its customary indifference to human difficulty. Miss Marple walked the length of the village twice before breakfast, which was a habit she maintained when thinking required movement, and which Frances had learned over the preceding fortnight not to question. She returned to find eggs and toast waiting, with the reliable kindness that characterized Frances Lee's domestic hospitality, and ate them at the kitchen table, while turning the whole matter over in her mind with the methodical patience of someone who has almost all the pieces and is determining the correct order of assembly. She knew, she thought, what had happened. The difficulty that always attended this particular stage was the difference between knowing and demonstrating, between the pattern made visible to a mind trained to see it and the pattern made visible to 12 people in a jury box who had not been watching Truiston for a fortnight and would require each thread laid out separately before the whole cloth became apparent. She needed several things simultaneously. She needed Leonard Holroyd to confirm formally the nature of the pressure that had been applied to him, and by whom. She had a tolerably clear idea of what that confirmation would show. But Holroyd's own account, given directly and without qualification, was considerably more useful than her inference. She thought Holroyd was ready to give it. The weight he had been carrying had been visible in his office on Wednesday, in the stillness of his hands and the quality of his silence, and she had seen people carry that particular weight long enough to recognize when it had become heavier than the alternative. She needed Tom Ashby's account of the moved glass to be formally recorded in precise detail, with the full context of the evening's sequence of events, where he had been, for how long, what he had seen on his return, and what he had told Gerald's right hand that evening in the first course, before Gerald's attention had been drawn elsewhere, and she needed Sylvia Marsh to describe the figure in the doorway again, this time to Inspector Rees directly, and to answer one additional question that Miss Marple had not asked on Thursday, because she had not yet understood its significance. Whether the figure, in the moment before the door closed, had been moving toward the hall or away from it. And she needed, most pressingly, to understand Peter Dayne. Not in the abstract. She had assembled a reasonable portrait of the type, and Gerald Voss's journal had sketched the specific contours with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years reading human behavior through legal documents. What she needed was something more concrete. What had Dayne actually known, and when, and through what channel? and because the operation she was increasingly certain she was looking at, the systematic mapping of a village's financial vulnerabilities, the quiet leverage applied to its most exposed resident, the careful elimination of the one man acute enough to have identified the pattern, required information. Considerable information. The kind that did not simply accumulate through 6 months of village residence and pleasant neighbourliness, however attentive. She needed to know how he had come to understand Leonard Holroyd's particular weakness. Because that was, she thought, the thread from which everything else had been pulled. Holroyd was not a man of obvious vulnerability. He was cautious, private, professionally careful. Whatever had made him susceptible to Dayne's pressure had not been visible on the surface of his daily life in Truiston. It had required knowledge, prior, specific, detailed knowledge, of something Holroyd had done or owed or feared that predated his life in this village. She was thinking about this when Constable Dayne arrived at 10, without shortbread pretext this time, carrying a manila envelope that he set on the kitchen table with the air of someone delivering something that has been awaited. "Inspector Rees asked me to bring this," he said. "He said you'd asked about Peter Dayne's background." Inside the envelope were 4 pages of printed notes. Miss Marple read them at the kitchen table, while Dayne stood with his helmet under his arm, and the barely suppressed expression of someone who has read the contents and found them considerably more interesting than expected. Peter Dayne, real name Philip Deaver, born 1971, at Wolverhampton, had a history that was not criminal in the prosecuted sense, but was richly suggestive in every other sense. He had worked in various capacities for 3 separate financial advisory firms over a period of 12 years, each of which had subsequently been investigated for irregularities. He had left each position before the investigations concluded. There had been 2 formal complaints of financial misconduct, neither of which had proceeded to prosecution. He had, the notes indicated, a particular professional history involving the management of client account records, specifically the identification and quiet exploitation of existing irregularities in the records of others, which he then used as leverage to redirect funds into arrangements that benefited himself. He did not create the vulnerabilities. He found them. He was, in the precise and damning phrase of one investigating officer's report, a man who looked for doors that were already slightly open. Leonard Holroyd's door, Miss Marple thought, had been slightly open for some time before Philip Deaver arrived in Truiston and found it. She set down the pages. "How long has Inspector Rees known this?" "Since yesterday evening," Dayne said. "The national database response came through at 6. She looked at the grey October sky through Francis's kitchen window and thought about timing. Deaver had moved into the village in March. Gerald Voss had noted his approach about the property investment in September. The journal entry declaring PD is not what he has represented himself to be was dated 3 days before the supper, in which meant Gerald had begun making his own inquiries in the fortnight between September and October, and had arrived at sufficient certainty to act. A retired solicitor with 30 years of experience reading people through documents, with connections to the legal and financial world, making quiet inquiries about a man who had presented himself falsely. That was not a negligible threat to Philip Deaver. That was an existential one. She thought about the arsenic. Arsenic was not an impulsive choice. It required acquisition, which required planning, which required a decision made in advance, days or weeks before the supper, that Gerald Voss was going to be removed. Diva had not panicked and acted. He had assessed, planned, and executed, with the same systematic patience he had applied to finding Leonard Holroyd's open door. "Denny," she said, "where is Peter Dayne this morning?" "At home, far as we know. Inspector Rees has a man watching the lane." He paused. "The inspector wanted me to ask, are you still of the same mind about this afternoon? Gathering them together?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, looking at the pages on the table. Gerald Voss's journal notation: "A careful man made careless by pressure from a direction I have not yet fully identified." Gerald had been close, had been dazed from identifying it fully, had been killed for that proximity. She thought about what it meant, what it had always meant in every case she had ever turned her attention to, that the person most dangerous in a room was not the one who acted from rage or jealousy or fear. The hot, familiar human emotions that left their traces everywhere. Of the most dangerous person was the one who felt none of those things, who looked at Gerald Voss across a chessboard of village relationships, his isolation, his precision, his letter-writing habits, his Sunday afternoons with Tom Ashby, and calculated, without heat, what needed to be done. That coldness was, she reflected, the one thing that could also be its own undoing. Emotional killers made frantic errors. Cold ones made precise ones. And precise errors, once identified, were very difficult to explain away. She had identified one. She had not yet told Inspector Rees which one it was, because she had wanted to be completely certain before she named it. She was this morning, in the thin grey October light, as certain as she needed to be. "Yes," she said to Constable Denny. "This afternoon. The parish hall, I think, is appropriate. And you might suggest to Inspector Rees that he ensure all the relevant parties receive a reason to attend that doesn't alarm them prematurely." She paused. "Tell him the seating doesn't matter. This time I think we can manage without Doris Peele's plan." Denny looked at her for a moment with that expression she had noticed developing over the week, the one that was still slightly surprised, though it had less excuse to be. Then he put on his helmet and went to find Inspector Rees. Chapter 10. The Parish Hall once more. Inspector Rees had chosen 4 o'clock. It was, Miss Marple thought, a good choice, the hour when October light begins its definitive retreat, when rooms require lamps, when the balance between interior and exterior tips toward enclosure. And the parish hall in lamplight was a different proposition from the parish hall in its Saturday evening configuration of harvest and community. The long tables had been moved to the walls. 7 chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle near the centre of the room, with 1 additional chair set slightly apart, facing them, which Miss Marple recognised as an arrangement designed to create the sensation of a focal point without the explicit confrontation of an interrogation. She approved of it. Inspector Rees, whatever his other qualities, understood rooms. They arrived in the order that people arrive when they have been summoned without being told precisely why. Carefully, at intervals, each reading the presence of the others with the rapid social calculation of people accustomed to a village's compressed geography of relationship. Old Tom Ashby came first, in his good jacket, the one he clearly wore for occasions that required acknowledgement. He sat and put his large hands on his knees and looked at the floor, with the focused quietness of a man who has been expecting something difficult, and has decided to meet it without flinching. Sylvia Marsh arrived 2 minutes later, noted the arrangement of chairs with a single comprehensive glance, and sat with the composed attention of a woman who has spent 30 years observing this village and is prepared to observe it once more. She carried a dark coat over her arm, which she folded precisely and placed across her lap. Leonard Holroyd came next alone and sat without looking at anyone, his hands performing their deliberate stillness on his thighs. He had, Miss Marple thought, made a decision during the night or that morning. There was a different quality to his stillness now, less like control and more like resolution. The stillness of someone who has stopped fighting the inevitable and found in that surrender a kind of relief. Doris Peele arrived with Ruth Gallo, who had been Gerald's immediate neighbour at the supper table, and who had not featured largely in Miss Marple's inquiries, but whose presence Rhys had judged useful. Another pair of eyes from that table, another account of the evening's sequence. Ruth Gallo was a small, worried-looking woman of 70, who sat very upright and kept her handbag on her lap with both hands around it, as though it might otherwise make an unwise decision independently. Philip Deaver, Peter Dayne, came last. He entered with the easy, measured pace of a man attending something routine, which Miss Marple found rather admirable in its way. He was of medium height, with a pleasant, unremarkable face that she now understood had been carefully maintained at precisely that level of unremarkability, not handsome enough to be memorable, not plain enough to draw sympathy, occupying the comfortable middle ground of a man whom people describe afterwards as seeming perfectly normal. He wore a dark coat. He glanced at the semicircle, registered each person with what appeared to be mild social curiosity, and sat in the remaining chair with the composed ease of someone who has sat in many difficult rooms and found the sitting manageable. He looked at Miss Marple once, then returned his gaze to Inspector Rhys. Rhys stood to one side of the focal chair, which he had left empty, but he thanked them for coming. He explained briefly and without drama that the investigation into Gerald Voss's death had reached a stage where he believed it useful to speak with several people together, in the interest of establishing a coherent account of Saturday evening. He said that a full account would serve everyone in the room, and that he hoped everyone would be willing to contribute to it. This was, Miss Marple reflected, beautifully done. It was an invitation, not an accusation. A gathering, not a trap. The distinction would matter for precisely as long as it needed to. "I'd like to begin," Miss Marple said from her chair at the far end of the semicircle, "if Inspector Rhys will permit me, with a question about the cordial." Rhys nodded, and Deaver looked at her with renewed attention, the first real attention he had directed at her since entering the room. "The cordial at the harvest supper," she said, addressing the room generally and no one specifically, "was served from a shared jug at each table. Inspector Rhys has confirmed that only Gerald Voss's glass contained arsenic, which means the arsenic was introduced into the glass rather than the jug." She paused. "Tom has told me that during the soup course he left his seat for approximately 60 seconds. When he returned, Gerald's glass had moved from the right side of his place to the left. I want to ask Ruth Gallo whether she noticed anything during those 60 seconds. Ruth Gallo's hands tightened on her handbag. "I wasn't watching particularly," she said. "I was talking to Doris across the table. But—" She stopped, frowned, continued with the careful effort of genuine recollection. Someone leaned across behind Gerald. I assumed it was Tom coming back. I didn't look properly. I had the impression of a dark sleeve. From the right side, Miss Marple said, or the left. From behind him, a pause. From behind and slightly to the right, but further right than Tom's seat, from the direction of the next chair along. The chair that had been empty all evening, Leonard Holroyd's assigned chair. Miss Marple allowed a brief silence before continuing. She did not look at Diva, though she was aware of him with the peripheral precision that years of practice had developed into something like a separate sense. The arsenic, she said, was introduced into Gerald's glass during those 60 seconds by someone who had approached from the right, from the direction of the empty chair, and who wore a dark sleeve. Someone who had access to the hall through the side door, which was opened with a key, and who had stood in that doorway perhaps 30 minutes earlier. She looked at Sylvia Marsh. Long enough to confirm that the seating was as expected, that Tom Ashby was in his usual position, and that there would be a moment of inattention. The cordial was poured later, Diva said pleasantly, conversationally. During the main course, not the soup. It was a small correction, offered with the confidence of a man who believes he has spotted an error. Miss Marple looked at him directly for the first time. Yes, she said, it was. Which means the arsenic was not introduced into the glass during the soup course, at when Tom left his seat. She paused. Tom said the glass was moved during the soup course. The arsenic was added later, during the main course, when the cordial was poured. The glass was moved earlier for a different reason. She let this sit for precisely a moment, to establish which glass was his. Gerald's glass was identical to the others. Moving it to a specific, noted position from his right to his left against his bread plate meant that during the main course, when the cordial was poured and attention was briefly distributed across the table, the correct glass could be identified without hesitation and without error. The room was completely still. It required 2 approaches, she continued, one to mark the glass, one to use it, both from the same position, the unoccupied chair to Gerald's right. Both accomplished within the natural movement of a busy room. Both planned with the knowledge of exactly where Gerald would sit, exactly who would sit beside him, and exactly when the person beside him could be relied upon to turn away. She looked at Diva steadily. You knew Tom Ashby got the bread himself. You had sat at that table at the harvest supper the year before, your first year in Trueston, and observed it. You had spent 6 months learning this village with professional thoroughness. You knew every relevant habit of every relevant person. This is remarkably imaginative, Diva said, still pleasant, still composed. I'm not sure what it has to do with me. Leonard, Miss Marple said quietly, without looking away from Diva. Holroyd's voice, when it came, had the quality of something long submerged reaching the surface. He came to me in May, he said, 4 months after he arrived. He had documentation, records from my previous practice in Bristol. There had been an irregularity years ago. A client account. It was not what I am here now. It was a single error of judgment that I had. He stopped, steadied himself. He had the documents. He told me what he wanted. Small adjustments to Tom Ashby's repayment records, creating a discrepancy between what Tom paid and what Gerald's records showed. The difference redirected to an account Diva controlled. A pause. He said it was temporary. He said it would be resolved before Gerald noticed. But Gerald noticed, Miss Marple said. Gerald always noticed, Holroyd said with a grief that was in its way a form of tribute. Diva had not moved. His face had not changed in any way that a casual observer would have registered. But Miss Marple, who was not a casual observer, saw the single small recalibration in his eyes, the moment when a man who has been running contingencies recognizes that the contingencies have run out. Gerald's journal, she continued, still addressing the room, records that he had identified Holroyd as operating under external pressure. He did not yet know the source. He proposed a private meeting at this hall after the supper to draw Holroyd out with discretion before acting. The letter was kept in his study. She paused. It was also photographed. There is an application on Gerald's computer, a cloud document service that automatically photographs and uploads documents placed on his desk. Gerald used it habitually for important correspondence. He was, as everyone in this village understood, a meticulous man. This was not entirely accurate. Miss Marple had suggested the possibility to Inspector Rees on Friday afternoon, and Rees had confirmed the existence of the application and the uploaded photograph that very morning, 2 hours before this gathering. The photograph showed Gerald's letter to Holroyd, time-stamped, clear. It also showed the reflection in the document's glossy envelope of a hand, partial gloved, replacing the letter after reading it. "You read the letter," she said to Diva. "You had been in the cottage." Gerald trusted his neighbours in the way that retired men living alone in English villages trust them, with a spare key for emergencies. "You used it. You read the letter, understood what it meant, and determined that Gerald would not reach Monday." Philip Diva looked at her for a long moment. Around him, the room held the particular silence of people who have stopped breathing in the way that people stop when something enormous is settling into its final position. Then he said, with the last exercise of the composure that had served him across 3 counties and 11 months in Truiston, "You have a reflection in a photograph that proves nothing, and the word of a man who has already admitted to fraud. That is not a prosecution." "No," Inspector Rees said from beside the empty chair, and his voice had lost all its earlier courtesy. "But the arsenic supplier in Taunton, who identified your photograph this morning, is." The composure broke. It did not shatter dramatically. There was no raised voice, no sudden movement. It simply ceased, like a light switched off, and what remained in the chair was a man who was, after all, entirely ordinary. Frightened, calculating, and ordinary. 2 constables entered from the side door, the same side door Miss Marple could not help noting, through which so much of this had passed, and Inspector Rees said the necessary words in the flat, careful cadence of a man who has said them before and understands their weight. Miss Marple looked at the cream walls of the parish hall and thought about Gerald Voss, who had been precise and difficult and decent, who had taught a young farmer chess on Sunday afternoons, and who had, in the last weeks of his life, been systematically and patiently hunted by a man he had been acute enough to identify and courteous enough to intend to approach privately first. That courtesy had cost him everything. She hoped, in the way she always hoped at this stage, that the resolution was worth something to the people left in its wake. It was never entirely worth it. It was simply the best that could be done. Tom Ashby had his hands over his face. Sylvia Marsh was looking at the empty chair where Gerald had sat a week ago, and her expression was not what Miss Marple had expected. It was not satisfaction. It was something quieter and more complicated. The face of a woman releasing a grief she had been carrying in the wrong direction for 6 years, and finding that the correct direction was not relief, but simply sadness. Leonard Holroyd sat very still, in the way of a man waiting to face what comes next, who has decided to face it without further evasion. Doris Peele, Miss Marple noticed, had opened her notebook and was writing in it with the small, precise movements of a woman recording what needs to be recorded. Even now. Outside, the October light finished its retreat entirely, and the lamps in the parish hall burned steadily against the dark, as they had burned through every harvest and meeting and gathering this village had assembled within these walls, and would continue to burn long after all of this had passed into the particular quiet of things that were terrible once and are now only known. Miss Marple gathered her coat and her bag and walked unhurried toward the door.